welcome to another edition of America's Godly Heritage. Did you know that the Constitutional Convention had ground to a halt due to the delegates' inability to find a mutually acceptable way forward? Then a prominent scientist declared they needed to pray about the situation. To find out more about who it was and what happened next, stay tuned. But first, America's Godly Heritage needs your help. All you have to do is click on the like and the subscribe or follow buttons. Every click helps, especially since we are a small organization. Thank you. In today's episode, we are continuing our series on the U.S. Constitution. Even though God is not directly mentioned in the Constitution, His fingerprints are all over it. In a previous episode, we looked at the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which was our nation's first governing document. The Articles were an epic fail, and they needed to be fixed. So in May 1787, delegates from all over the nation, except for Rhode Island, which didn't send any delegates at any point in time, gathered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in what became known as the Philadelphia or the Constitutional Convention. The delegates met in the Pennsylvania State House, in the very room where, 11 years earlier, they had signed the Declaration of Independence. The delegates took an oath that everything that took place in the convention would remain a secret until everything was done and dusted. And they even had the windows sealed shut so no one could overhear their conversations, even though it was in the middle of summer. In a letter written to Thomas Jefferson on May 30th, 1787, George Washington wrote, quote, "The business of this convention is as yet too much in embryo to form any opinion of the result. Much is expected from it by some, but little by others, and nothing by a few. That something is necessary, all will agree, for the situation of the general government, if it can be called a government, is shaken to its foundation, and liable to be overset by every blast. In a word, it is at an end, and unless a remedy is soon applied, anarchy and confusion will inevitably ensue." The other delegates obviously shared this opinion, because in mid-June the delegates agreed to scrap the Articles of Confederation and start over. After a few weeks of deliberation, the convention was on the verge of collapse. The delegates agreed a new form of government was necessary, but they were deadlocked on different issues. Governor Morris commented that America's, quote, "band of federal union had been woven by the hand of distrust. The different states had been held together, in no small degree, by the external pressure of war. That pressure removed, they might fall asunder." End quote. The most contentious issue was how each state would be represented in Congress. The Virginia plan was proposed by, surprise, surprise, the delegates from Virginia, led by James Madison and Edmund Randolph. It called for a national government to be comprised of 3 branches, with checks and balances to ensure that there was no abuse of power. The legislative branch would be bicameral, which means it would have 2 houses, with the first body being comprised of directly elected representatives, and the second body having representatives appointed by the first body. It called for the number of representatives to be proportioned by, quote, "some equitable ratio of representation," end quote, according to the population of each state. The smaller and less populous states understandably did not like this plan because they believed they would have little say in the national government. So they came up with the New Jersey plan, which was proposed by, you guessed it, the delegates from New Jersey, led by William Patterson. It called for a unicameral legislature, which means just one house, with an equal number of representatives for each state. Well, the larger and more populous states didn't like this idea because it gave the smaller states equal standing with them. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 1790, Massachusetts had an estimated population of 378,555, while Georgia's population was estimated to be 82,548. This means that Massachusetts' population was 4.5 times larger than Georgia's, but Georgia wanted equal representation in Congress. You can see why states like Massachusetts didn't agree with this. Alexander Hamilton let the fur fly on June 18th. He wasn't thrilled by either plan, but he hated the New Jersey plan. And he made his opinions known as he called for a strong, centralized government in a 6-hour-long speech. 6 hours long! The New Jersey plan was officially rejected the next day, and the delegates began tweaking the Virginia plan to make it acceptable to everyone. This was a nearly impossible task as the more populous and less populous states' delegates feared losing power in the legislature if they adopted the other group's ideas for representation. Eventually, deliberations ground to a halt, and some delegates were considering adjourning, or basically finishing, the convention. At this point, on June 28th, Benjamin Franklin had had enough of the squabbling. He sought to change the delegates' attitudes and perspectives so they could come to an acceptable compromise. He began his speech by noting how little progress they had made due to their discord and to their reliance on their intellectual skills, particularly in history and political science. He remarked, quote, "The small progress we have made after 4 or 5 weeks is melancholy proof of the imperfection of the human understanding. In this situation of this assembly, groping, as it were, in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us." End quote. Franklin then opined that instead of groping in the dark of secular learning, they should have been seeking wisdom from the Father of Lights, for unless God helped the convention, they would not be successful. He stated, quote, "How has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of Lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayers in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time. That would be 81 years at this point. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men." And he emphasized that. "And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this. And I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. And we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of the city be requested to officiate in that service." End quote. According to David and Tim Barton in The American Story, The Beginnings, Franklin's speech contains no fewer than 8 biblical references. 1. Groping in the dark, from Job 12:25. 2. The Father of Lights, from James 1:17. 3. Illuminate our understanding, from James 1:5. 4. A sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, from Matthew 10:29. 5. Can an empire rise without his aid, from Daniel 4:17. 6. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it, from Psalm 127:1. 7. The builders of Babel, from Genesis 11:1-9. And finally 8. A reproach and a byword, from Deuteronomy 28:37. The delegates would have understood these biblical references because during this time period, people learned to read by using the Bible, and they read it at home regularly. They also obviously learned about it on Sunday mornings at church, which most people would attend services on Sunday morning. They also, believe it or not, learned about the Bible in school. Further, the Bible was considered to be a source of authority, and according to Donald Lutz in The Origins of American Constitutionalism, the Bible was by far the book cited most often in political literature from 1760 to 1805. Thus, these biblical references would have added weight to Franklin's speech. According to James Madison's notes on the proceedings, Roger Sherman of Connecticut seconded the motion, but Alexander Hamilton and others feared what those who were not part of the convention would think about this action. Madison noted that they, quote, expressed their apprehensions that it might, 1. Bring on it some disagreeable animadversions, which means criticisms, and 2. Lead the public to believe that the embarrassments and dissensions within the convention had suggested this measure, end quote. So Hamilton and company weren't against the idea of praying in the convention as such. What they were concerned about was how it was going to look to the people who weren't at the convention. They were afraid that the public would believe, and rightly so, that things were going badly at the convention, and that this would lead to gossip and speculation. Hugh Williamson of North Carolina then observed that the convention couldn't have a minister lead prayers because they had no funds with which to pay the minister. Today we might not understand why this would be an issue because we're used to members of the clergy being asked to pray for a meal or to open up a meeting in prayer, and they do so informally and spontaneously. However, during this time period, the clergy acted in a much more formal way. By saying, let's get a clergyman in here to pray, really what's being said is, we need to hire a chaplain. He will come in with his robes and his religious paraphernalia every day and lead us in formal prayers, and we will pay him for doing a job for us. Since the delegates were there as volunteers, they were paying for their own expenses. So they didn't have money left over to be hiring a chaplain. So these negative reactions were not a rejection of the idea of praying to God to illuminate their understandings and for the Lord to build the house of this new nation. Rather, it was a practical concern. The fact that the idea of daily prayer to open their sessions was not rejected can be seen in that only a few days after the first Congress elected under the Constitution officially convened, it implemented Franklin's recommendation of hiring 2 chaplains of different denominations, one for the House and one for the Senate, who led daily prayer. The Senate accepted this resolution on April 15, 1789, and the House concurred on April 18, 1789. Madison noted that the delegates ended the day without voting on any of the motions concerning prayer. Then the convention adjourned for a few days to give the delegates time to cool off, literally and figuratively, and to be able to attend some 4th of July celebrations. It also gave a committee time to meet and to formulate a solution concerning the issue of representation in the legislature. Washington and many other delegates attended an oration at the Calvinist Reformed Church, where Reverend William Rogers prayed for the nation and for the convention. His prayer was later printed in the August 15th, 1787 edition of the Massachusetts Sentinel newspaper. Quote, "We fervently recommend to thy fatherly notice our federal convention. Favor them from day to day with thy immediate presence. Be thou their wisdom and their strength. Enable them to devise such measures as may prove happily instrumental for healing all divisions and promoting the good of the great whole, that the United States of America may furnish the world with one example of a free and permanent government. May we continue, under the influence of republican virtue, to partake of all the blessings of cultivated and civilized society. Amen." End quote. This prayer really emphasized the need for unity. And God answered that prayer, because when the delegates reconvened, there was a change in the atmosphere. The delegates had realized that if they could not find a way forward together, then the country was going to disintegrate. The states needed to defer their own interests and to focus on what was best for the nation as a whole. Delegate William Few from Georgia describes this in his autobiography. Quote, "If the convention had adjourned, the dissolution of the Union of the States seemed inevitable. This consideration, no doubt, had its weight in reconciling clashing opinions and interests. It was believed to be of the utmost importance to concede to different opinions so far as to endeavor to meet opposition on middle ground, and to form a constitution that might preserve the union of the states. On that principle of accommodation, the business progressed, and after about 3 months' arduous labor, a plan of constitution was formed." End quote. The most important meeting on middle ground took place when Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed what became known as the Great or Connecticut Compromise. In it, he took the ideas from both the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan concerning representation in Congress. Congress would be bicameral, with the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, having their representatives elected directly by the residents of each electoral district. The upper chamber, the Senate, would be comprised of 2 delegates from each state, and each state's legislature would decide who gets to go. It wasn't until the passage of the 17th Amendment in 1913 that American citizens from each state got to vote directly for their U.S. senators. With this balance in representation, no state would have greater power over the others or be more valuable than the others in Congress. Although the vote was close, the Great Compromise passed. At last, the delegates had found a way forward. And even Alexander Hamilton, who had previously been concerned about what people would think about suddenly bringing in a chaplain for prayer, believed God's hand was upon this. In a letter he wrote to Mr. Childs on October 17, 1787, which was 1 month after the Constitution had been signed and sent to Congress, he acknowledged God's intervention in the creation of the Constitution. He wrote, quote, "For my own part, I sincerely esteem it a system which without the finger of God never could have been suggested and agreed upon by such a diversity of interests." End quote. The final takeaway. The Constitutional Convention was one of the pivotal moments in U.S. history, and it nearly crashed and burned. Yet Benjamin Franklin's speech pushed the quarreling delegates to stop focusing on that which was contentious and served their own interests, and to start focusing on what would be best for the nation as a whole. His call for prayer reminded them that even though they were intelligent and insightful, if they proceeded without God's guidance and succor, their efforts would be in vain. After a 4th of July timeout for an attitude adjustment, the delegates resumed their debates. This time, a workable compromise was found, and the rest, as they say, was history. Thank you for listening to this edition of America's Godly Heritage. I hope you have a great day. Bye. Help us spread our message. Please support us through any or all of the following. 1. Clicking the like button for this podcast. 2. Becoming a forerunner and subscribing to our page on Buzzsprout or Patreon, which will sow some financial provision into our work. 3. Following us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Truth, or X. And finally, 4. Praying for us. If you want to check out the primary and secondary sources used to make this podcast, you can view them at the end of the video version, which is shown on YouTube and Patreon. We really appreciate your support. Thanks again. Bye.